What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy meets The View's most confrontational panel? You won't believe what unfolds when Clint Eastwood sits down for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview and instead becomes the center of the most explosive live television meltdown in recent memory. This isn't just another celebrity interview gone wrong. This is a masterclass in how quickly things can spiral completely out of control when egos clash and political differences ignite into an inferno that threatens to burn down everything in its path. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when one of cinema's most respected figures goes head-to-head with a panel that clearly came prepared for war. The tension was palpable from the moment Clint Eastwood stepped onto The View's set. At 94 years old, the legendary actor and director carried himself with the same commanding presence that had made him an icon. But there was something different in the air that morning. The usual pre-show banter between the hosts seemed more forced than usual, their smiles a little too bright, their laughter a little too loud. Joy Behar kept glancing at her notes with an intensity that suggested this wasn't going to be your typical softball celebrity interview, while Whoopi Goldberg's usually warm demeanor seemed notably cooler as she shuffled through her cards. Sunny Hostin sat rigid in her chair, her jaw set in a way that anyone familiar with The View would recognize as her preparation for battle mode. Sarah Haynes tried to maintain her usual bubbly energy, but even she seemed to sense the undercurrent of hostility that was building like storm clouds before a hurricane. Alyssa Farah Griffin, the panel's conservative voice, looked particularly uncomfortable, as if she knew she was about to be caught in crossfire that had nothing to do with her. The show's producers had booked Eastwood to promote his latest directorial effort, but it was clear from the moment the cameras started rolling that this interview had a different agenda entirely. The opening pleasantries felt like a charade, with each host delivering their scripted introductions with a kind of artificial enthusiasm that barely masked their true intentions. We're so excited to have the legendary Clint Eastwood with us today, Whoopi announced to the studio audience, her voice lacking its usual warmth. Director, actor, and someone who's never been afraid to speak his mind about the state of our country. The emphasis on that last phrase hung in the air like a challenge, and Eastwood, with decades of experience reading between the lines in Hollywood, immediately picked up on the subtext. His eyes narrowed slightly, that famous Eastwood squint that had intimidated countless movie villains now focused on the women sitting across from him. "Well, I appreciate being here," Eastwood replied, his voice carrying that familiar gravelly tone that had commanded respect in boardrooms and on movie sets for over half a century. "Though I have to say, I'm getting the feeling this might not be the typical interview I was expecting." Joy Behar leaned forward, her smile sharp enough to cut glass. "Oh, we definitely want to talk about your movies, Clint. But we also think our audience would be interested in hearing your thoughts on some of the more pressing issues facing our country right now." The way she said pressing issues made it clear this wasn't going to be a discussion about filmmaking techniques or Hollywood anecdotes. Eastwood had been in enough hostile negotiations to recognize when he was being set up, and his expression hardened accordingly. "I'm here to talk about my work," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. "If you want to have a political debate, maybe you should have booked a politician instead of a filmmaker." Sunny Hostin jumped in before anyone else could respond, her voice dripping with barely concealed disdain. "But Clint, you've never shied away from making your political views known. You've been quite vocal about your support for certain candidates and policies that many people find deeply troubling." The studio audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension that was building between the panel and their guest. This wasn't the light-hearted celebrity interview they had expected when they got their tickets to The View, and the uncomfortable silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Eastwood finally responded. "I've always believed in speaking my mind," he said slowly, each word carefully measured. "But I also believe in respecting different viewpoints, something that seems to be in short supply these days." The dig was subtle but unmistakable, and the hosts clearly felt it. Whoopi's expression darkened, while Joy's smile became even more forced. Sarah Haynes tried to jump in and redirect the conversation towards safer territory, asking about Eastwood's creative process, but it was too late. The battle lines had been drawn, and there was no going back. Speaking of different viewpoints, Joy said, completely ignoring Sarah's attempt at diplomacy. What's your take on the current political climate? Do you think the divisiveness we're seeing is healthy for democracy? It was a loaded question if there ever was one, designed to trap Eastwood no matter how he answered. If he criticized the divisiveness, they could twist it into an attack on their preferred political figures. If he defended robust political debate, they could paint him as supporting extremism. Eastwood had walked into enough ambushes in his business career to recognize the setup, and his response made it clear he wasn't going to play their game. I think the biggest threat to democracy is when people in positions of influence use their platforms to shut down honest discussion, he said, his voice remaining steady despite the obvious provocation. When you create an environment where only one perspective is allowed, you're not promoting democracy, you're undermining it. The silence that followed was deafening. The studio audience seemed to collectively hold their breath, sensing that something significant was happening but not quite sure what. The hosts exchanged glances that spoke volumes, their carefully crafted ambush beginning to backfire as their guest refused to be intimidated. Sonny Hostin's composure finally cracked. Are you seriously suggesting that calling out dangerous rhetoric and harmful policies is somehow anti-democratic? She demanded, her voice rising with indignation. Some viewpoints don't deserve a platform, especially when they promote hate and division. And who gets to decide which viewpoints are acceptable? Eastwood shot back, his legendary cool beginning to show cracks. You? The media? A handful of people in New York and Los Angeles who think they know what's best for everyone else. The confrontation was escalating rapidly, and even the show's producers seemed unsure how to handle the situation. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of the increasingly hostile exchange, while the studio audience watched in stunned silence as one of Hollywood's most respected figures went toe-to-toe with a panel that had clearly underestimated their opponent. But this was just the beginning. The real fireworks were yet to come, and what happened next would turn this already explosive situation into something far more dramatic than anyone could have anticipated. Whoopi Goldberg, who had been uncharacteristically quiet during the initial exchange, suddenly leaned forward with the kind of expression that longtime viewers knew meant she was about to drop the hammer. Her voice carried a weight of authority that seemed to fill the entire studio as she prepared to deliver what was clearly intended to be the knockout punch. Clint, let's be real here, she said, her tone deceptively calm, but with an underlying edge that cut through the air like a blade. You've spent years supporting politicians and policies that have actively harmed marginalized communities. How do you reconcile that with sitting here today, talking about respecting different viewpoints, when your viewpoints have contributed to real pain and suffering? The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud, and the studio audience's collective gasp was audible even through the television microphones. This wasn't just political disagreement anymore. This was a direct attack on Eastwood's character and legacy. The legendary director's face hardened into an expression that would have made Dirty Harry proud, his jaw clenching as he processed what had just been said. That's quite an accusation, Whoopi, Eastwood replied, his voice dropping to that dangerous whisper that had intimidated countless Hollywood executives over the decades. Are you suggesting that anyone who doesn't share your political views is automatically responsible for harming people? Because that sounds like exactly the kind of thinking that's tearing this country apart. Joy Behar, sensing blood in the water, decided to pile on. But you can't deny that some of the candidates you've supported have promoted divisive rhetoric. When you give your endorsement to people who traffic in hate speech, don't you bear some responsibility for the consequences? Hate speech. Eastwood's voice rose for the first time since the interview began, and suddenly the man who had commanded movie sets and boardrooms was fully present in that studio. You're accusing me of supporting hate speech? That's rich, coming from a panel that spends every single day attacking and demonizing anyone who dares to think differently than you do. The gloves were officially off now. Sarah Haynes made one last desperate attempt to restore some semblance of civility to the proceedings, her voice taking on a pleading quality as she tried to redirect the conversation. Maybe we could talk about your new film? I'm sure our audience would love to hear about your creative process and what drew you to this particular story. But her words fell on deaf ears. The confrontation had reached a point of no return, and Both sides seemed determined to see it through to whatever bitter end awaited. Sunny Hostin, emboldened by what she perceived as momentum, decided to escalate things even further. The problem, Clint, is that your generation seems to think you can hide behind different viewpoints when what you're really defending are outdated, harmful ideologies that have no place in modern society, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. Maybe it's time to admit that some of your perspectives are simply wrong and need to be left in the past where they belong. The patronizing tone and dismissive attitude finally pushed Eastwood past his breaking point. The man who had built an empire in Hollywood through sheer force of will and determination wasn't about to be lectured by people he clearly viewed as hypocrites and bullies. "Let me tell you something," he said, his voice now carrying the full weight of his decades in the public eye. "I've been in this business longer than some of you have been alive, and I've seen every kind of ideological bullying there is. What you're doing right now, trying to shame me into submission because I won't conform to your narrow worldview, is exactly the kind of authoritarian thinking that free societies are supposed to reject." The words hit their target with devastating accuracy. The hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances, suddenly realizing that their carefully planned ambush was backfiring spectacularly. But instead of backing down, they doubled down on their attack strategy. That Whoopi's response was swift and brutal. "Authoritarian? That's interesting coming from someone who spent years supporting actual authoritarians. Maybe the problem isn't that we're being unfair to you, Clint. Maybe the problem is that you're finally being held accountable for the positions you've taken." Held accountable. Eastwood's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Is that what you call this? Setting up an ambush? Interview designed to humiliate me on national television? If this is your idea of accountability, then you've proven my point about the sorry state of public discourse in this country." The tension in the studio was now so thick it was almost suffocating. The camera crew continued filming, capturing every moment of what was clearly becoming one of the most explosive celebrity interviews in television history. The audience sat in stunned silence, many of them looking genuinely uncomfortable as they witnessed what felt less like an interview and more like a public execution. Alyssa Farah Griffin, who had remained silent throughout most of the confrontation, finally spoke up, perhaps sensing that things had gone too far. "I think we might be losing sight of why Clint is here today. Maybe we should focus on his remarkable career and the stories he wants to tell through his films." But her attempt at peacemaking was immediately shot down by her own colleagues. Joy turned on her with barely concealed irritation. "Alyssa, we can't just ignore the elephant in the room. When public figures use their influence to promote harmful ideologies, we have a responsibility to address it." "Harmful ideologies?" Eastwood interjected, his voice now carrying a dangerous edge. "You mean like the ideology that says people should be allowed to think for themselves? Or the radical notion that maybe, just maybe, the media doesn't have all the answers?" The sarcasm was biting, and it clearly struck a nerve. Sunny Hostin's response was immediate and vicious. "Don't try to play the victim here, Clint. You've had decades to use your platform responsibly, and instead you've chosen to align yourself with forces that actively work against progress and equality." "Progress and equality according to who?" Eastwood shot back. "According to you? According to this panel? You sit here in your bubble, surrounded by people who agree with everything you say, and you think that gives you the right to judge everyone else. Well, let me tell you something. The real world doesn't revolve around what happens in this studio." The confrontation was reaching a crescendo, with both sides now fully committed to total war. The pretense of a civilized interview had been completely abandoned, replaced by something that looked more like a bare-knuckled political brawl. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get any more intense, Whoopi prepared to deliver what she clearly intended to be the final, crushing blow. "You know what, Clint," she said, her voice now carrying a tone of absolute finality. "Maybe the real problem here is that you've spent so many years being celebrated and praised that you've forgotten what it's like to be challenged. Maybe it's time someone told you that your opinions aren't automatically valid just because you're famous." The insult landed like a physical blow, and for a moment, Eastwood sat in complete silence, his famous composure finally cracking under the sustained assault. But what happened next would shock everyone in that studio and set the stage for the most dramatic conclusion anyone could have imagined. When Clint Eastwood finally spoke again, His voice was completely different from anything they had heard during the entire interview. Gone was the measured tone of a Hollywood professional trying to maintain civility. Gone was the careful diplomacy of someone attempting to navigate a hostile environment. What emerged instead was the voice of a man who had reached his absolute limit and was about to unleash decades of pent-up frustration on people who had clearly underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. "You know what, ladies?" he said, his voice so quiet that everyone in the studio had to strain to hear him, but carrying such intensity that it felt like he was shouting. "I came here today as a courtesy. I came here to talk about my work, to share some stories, maybe, give your audience a little entertainment. But what I walked into was an ambush by a group of people who think their job is to be judge, jury, and executioner for anyone who doesn't march in lockstep with their political agenda." He paused, letting his words sink in, his steely gaze moving from one host to another as if he were taking their measure and finding them all wanting. The studio was so quiet you could hear the cameras whirring, capturing every moment of what was clearly about to become television history. "You want to talk about harmful ideologies?" Eastwood continued, his voice beginning to rise, but maintaining that razor-sharp precision that had made him one of Hollywood's most feared negotiators. "Let me tell you about a harmful ideology. It's the ideology that says if you disagree with the mainstream media narrative, you're automatically a bad person. It's the ideology that says certain viewpoints are so dangerous they can't even be discussed. It's the ideology that turns every conversation into a moral inquisition where you're either with us 100% or you're the enemy." Whoopi tried to interrupt, but Eastwood wasn't finished. He held up a hand with such authority that she actually stopped mid-sentence, something that rarely happened on The View. "I'm not done," he said firmly. "You asked me here supposedly to promote my film, but what you really wanted was to put me on trial for the crime of thinking independently. Well, congratulations. You got your show trial, but you might not like how it ends." Joy Behar, clearly rattled by the turn the conversation had taken, tried to regain control. "Clint, we're just trying to have an honest conversation about important issues. There's no need to get so defensive." Eastwood's laugh was sharp and bitter. "Defensive? Lady, I've been in this business for over 60 years. I've dealt with studio executives, agents, politicians, and every other kind of shark you can imagine. And let me tell you something. I've never encountered a more dishonest form of ambush journalism than what you just tried to pull on me." The accusation hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. The hosts exchanged panicked glances, clearly realizing that their carefully orchestrated attack had not only failed, but had spectacularly backfired. They had expected to intimidate an elderly actor and instead had awakened something far more dangerous. A Hollywood legend with nothing left to lose and decades of experience dealing with bullies. Sonny Hostin made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "We're not trying to ambush anyone. We're just asking legitimate questions about the responsibilities that come with having a public platform." "Responsibilities?" Eastwood's voice was now loaded with contempt. "You want to lecture me about responsibilities? Let me tell you about responsibility. Responsibility is using your platform to encourage dialogue, not shut it down. Responsibility is treating your guests with basic respect, not setting them up to be humiliated. Responsibility is admitting when you're wrong instead of doubling down on your mistakes." He stood up slowly, his imposing figure casting a shadow over the panel that seemed both literal and metaphorical. The studio audience was completely transfixed, witnessing something they had never seen before. A complete dismantling of The View's carefully constructed narrative by someone who refused to be intimidated. "But most of all," Eastwood continued, his voice now carrying the full weight of his legendary screen presence, "responsibility is knowing when you've crossed a line and having the dignity to back down. Since none of you seem capable of that, I'm going to do what I should have done the moment I realized what kind of setup this was." The tension in the studio reached a breaking point as everyone waited to see what would happen next. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of what was clearly becoming one of the most explosive moments in daytime television history. Whoopi made one final attempt to maintain some semblance of control over the situation. "Clint, please sit down. We can discuss this like adults." Eastwood's response was delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that had made him a movie icon. "Adults? You think what you just did was adult behavior? You brought me here under false Pretenses launched a coordinated attack on my character and then tried to gaslight me when I called you out on it. If this is your idea of adult behavior, then I want no part of it. He reached down and unclipped his microphone with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested he had been planning this moment for several minutes. The small action somehow carried enormous symbolic weight, like a gunslinger removing his holster before walking away from a fight. I've been in this business long enough to know when I'm being set up, he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned studio despite no longer wearing a microphone. And I'm old enough not to waste my time with people who think ambush journalism passes for legitimate discourse. Joy Behar made one last desperate attempt to keep him from leaving. Clint, come on. Don't you think you're overreacting? We're just having a conversation. Eastwood paused at the edge of the interview area and turned back to face the panel one final time. His expression was a mixture of disappointment and disgust that seemed to encompass not just the hosts but everything they represented. A conversation, he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent studio. Lady, what you just attempted wasn't a conversation. It was a public execution disguised as an interview. The only difference is, this time you picked the wrong target. With that, Clint Eastwood turned and walked off the Views set with the same commanding presence that had made him a legend in Hollywood. No dramatic flourishes, no shouting, no theatrical gestures, just the quiet dignity of a man who had refused to be bullied and had the courage to walk away when he realized he was dealing with people who had no interest in honest dialogue. The studio remained in complete silence for several long seconds after his departure, the hosts sitting in stunned disbelief as they processed what had just happened. Their carefully planned ambush had not only failed, but had resulted in one of the most humiliating public defeats in the show's history. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of their shocked expressions as they realized that their attempt to take down a Hollywood legend had instead revealed their own tactics for exactly what they were: mean-spirited bullying disguised as moral righteousness. When the show finally cut to commercial, it was clear that something fundamental had shifted and that this confrontation would be remembered long after the credits rolled.